Hey, Baba. Thank you for coming. Before I begin today's talk, this is talk 8. And before I begin, I want to talk about a word that's going to be used more starting in this talk and then more in the next talk. And this is important to me personally because when I wrote my book, a couple people who had some academic background in philosophy, not PhDs though, okay? They completely got my use of the word perception. But some people who were educated people said, well, you used the word perception wrong because perception only means sense perception, like smelling and tasting. And actually what we say, the verb, I perceive that she's going to be late. I perceive that he's a good person. You know, you get that? We actually use it like I see the writing on the wall. We don't just mean a sense perception in use of the word perceive. However, the word perception, I looked it up in every dictionary, said that it meant only applied to sense perception, which is strange because the verb is to perceive from percipio, or percipi, and the word perception is the abstract noun for that verb. So I was confounded because I wanted to put to rest this objection because there is no synonym actually for the word perception. Okay, there's the word experience, but it doesn't mean the same thing. Experience is kind of like, I want to experience being a mother. You know, it's not the same as I want to perceive, my child. You know, it's different. It's a different word. So without it, so I spent a lot of time researching what happened. Why is this? Because see, when I studied philosophy, all the philosophers that I was reading, which were from the Enlightenment, used the word in its general sense as I meant it, which was to perceive anything, even perceive your dreams. Okay? Not just sense perception with the eyes of external objects. So, in doing this research, I discovered the following. I was saying, also the word in my book, my 2004 book, the word perception was given to me by Sandra Edwards, who was a tenured professor, and who read an earlier version. Okay, and a lot of people gave me feedback. So the word perception is what you mean is perception. And she taught Enlightenment philosophy. She was my teacher of the Enlightenment. So the wording, now we're going to see what happened, and we're going to see that I'm using it right in its classical sense, and what happened to the word perception that didn't happen to the word perceive. Now this is important because I'm going to use the word perception as a noun, as an abstract noun for an act. Okay? So, first of all, about dictionaries. People were thumping dictionaries at me. Shakespeare coined 1,700 words, and he lived 140 years before the first dictionary. There was a time when you coined your words and people understood them from their context. And now it's gotten narrower and narrower. And now if you do online searches for dictionary meanings, they're all the same. It's all getting homogenized. So here's the etymology of the word perception. And it's very interesting and it's very important. In Infinite Intelligence, Baba uses the word instead of saying perception because he knows that it's the objection. He says take experience of. You can look that up in Infinite Intelligence, the original. Now, the original notebooks. Now, the original etymology of the word means to obtain, gather, seize entirely, take possession of. Okay? Take something. To grasp with the mind. So to grasp with the mind. Okay, this is perceive. Literally to take entirely, from thoroughly, capere, to grasp. Okay? So we still use words like grasp for what we mean by to perceive. We say, I grasp your meaning. I get what you mean. I take you to mean. We still actually have that original sense of a gathering of knowledge through something. That it doesn't, okay. But none of these, by the way, apply to sense perception. Grasp, get what you mean, I take you to mean. They're referring to the mental. Now, the word perception, which is the abstract noun for the verb, it meant from the 14th century, the 1300s, receiving, collection, from the, or taking. First used as taking cognizance of, which is how I'm using it, from the 1610s, okay? This is even one of the meanings in the current OED of the Oxford Dictionary, okay? It's that unabridged one that I went to the library to look at. It can mean in law still the collection of rents, profits, dues, etc. Okay? There must have been something more than a mere perception of profits. Okay? So it means taking. Now, in the Enlightenment, they used the word perception. They were just getting the first dictionaries. And these are from Enlightenment era dictionaries. And they define the word in its broad sense, how I'm going to use it, as I'm going to give three dictionary definitions. And I'm not going to cite them because it's more than you need to know. The first one means the act of perceiving, comprehending, or knowing. A clear, distinct apprehension of any object. That means it could be a mental object. It could be a dream. Got it? The next one says the same thing. It makes this equivocation. In 1707, it's a clear and distinct apprehension of objects offered to us without inferring any judgment concerning them. Again, that means they could be dreams, they could be thoughts, they could be pain, they could be a worry. You know, I perceive my worry. And the power of perceiving knowledge consciousness. So many dictionaries say that in this period the word meant basically the same thing as consciousness. Now consciousness is a little different, and it relates to perception, but we're going to talk about it later. For now we're just going to use the word perception. Sorry, I'm spending so much time on a word. But in 1785, because at the end of the Enlightenment, people were so bothered by those philosophers I went over in the Enlightenment, including Berkeley and stuff like that they decided to just put in the definition of the word, taking things from the external world, the theoretical one. So they're putting a theory, and okay. So it was by it was a Scottish philosopher at the end of the Enlightenment, Thomas Reid, who was really an amateur philosopher. He never studied philosophy. But he was, he had this idea of common sense. And he insisted that the external world, because they believed that, you know, I've talked about how do we know there's this theoretical other world besides our world of our experience, which I say is a mytheme, by the way, last week. He said that, he insisted that the external world as a cause of perception, sense perception, be codified into the meaning of the word perception, where it remains to this day. Because dictionaries followed his lead, anyone afterward talking about perception by any alternative cause, or even considering something about the cause which has not been determined, as I explained, that's the whole mind-body problem, we don't know how to explain our experience. They said, well, you're not, by definition, you're not talking about perception. So if you want to talk about perception, you have to find another word. So philosophers are completely hand-tied because they end up using words they don't mean, like experience and consciousness and stuff. And one of the people who suffers from this is, his name is David Chalmers. Anybody can look that up and watch his TED Talk. It's not what he means, but he can't use the word perception because they're all like, well, there's rules. That's why I said Shakespeare created 1,700 words. This is a new thing where we have the dictionary police. Now, this codifies a mysterious and unprovable theory into a definition of what it is we seek to explain. This prevents us through language from even discussing it in a new way. That's why this is important. This caused incomparable damage to philosophy. Basically, philosophy stopped at the end of the Enlightenment, and this is one of the reasons. Tying its own hands, philosophy's tied its own hands from seeking alternative causes besides the mytheme of an external world for perception. Now, all this, turns out, was on the advice of a cocky, self-proclaimed baronet named Sir William Hamilton. And you go through all the unabridged dictionaries, and they quote Hamilton as saying it's this because of Thomas Reid. So the dictionary authors got bullied because it's irrational for the abstract noun for a verb to be inconsistent with the verb it is a noun for. Because in the new Oxford American Dictionary, it gives inconsistent definitions for the word perceive and the word perception, which is the noun for the verb. The first one, it says it exactly as I'm using it. It means to become aware or conscious of anything. The second one is become aware of something through the senses, if we use the word perception. So that's like a bugaboo. It's incongruous use. So there is an error in lexicography. I'm using the word right. They have to work out their problem. Okay, I define the word this way so that you'll know. Taking experience of any kind of phenomenon, whether mental or physical, and we can consciously attend to or be aware of. So the taking of any kind of experience. When we attend to say sense perception, we'll say sense perception, because that is a term. And then it'll be clear what we mean, because that's a subgroup of perception. Okay, and then the other would be mental perception, if we're talking about looking at perceiving our thoughts. Now, we begin the talk. Baba and the Future, Part 8. Perception and perceptual schemas. You'll understand what that means as we go on. The nature of our experience. Now, I forgot to say this at the end of the talk last week. I said that we can't explain experience. That's the mind-body problem. Mind-body causal problem is we don't know how it is that we get this experience from supposed electrical firings and things, or whatever your theory is. Nobody knows how to make that final step. But there is a way, and that's where we're going to come to. It's just not possible with our current modes of finding truth. Showing the way of thinking that is intuitive, that can determine cause, is what we're doing. That's where we're going. So I just wanted to make that distinction. I'm not saying nobody can ever determine the cause. We can determine the cause, and that's the point of giving these talks. Okay, but that's a couple talks from now. Now, we're really starting the talk now, okay? Now we're referring back, wipe your mind, clear it out. Just put that on a shelf somewhere about perception. This is not going to come up for a little while. Last week we saw that the emperor has no clothes. For sense perception, logic, and even the methods of science fail us in seeking causes. They have no way to do it. The problem of cause still lays beyond our grasp by our current modes of inquiry. Mythemes didn't work, something we talked about a lot last week, and I was repeated myself a lot, so I don't need to. There are explanations. These are explanations in name only. And frankly, like a substratum. Okay? And frankly, they solve nothing, and now we have them to explain. So that doesn't work. It never has. That's been going on for 2,600 years, and it has never worked. We want a cause without mythemes. We're going to find a new way. Last week we saw that our experience is ultimately all we have to explain. For isn't that what we mean when we say we seek a cause? I said last week, when I want to know the cause of a stone falling when I let it go, I mean, why is it that whenever I see my hand let go of a stone, I see the stone fall? Well, everything that we're talking about is perception, okay? Is part of our experience. Even your idea of an external world or a substratum is an idea in your mind, which is an experience. And if you're trying to explain it, you're trying to explain experience. This is what we've been going over for a long time. Last week we saw that our experience is ultimately all we have to explain for, okay, so I said that. It was to explain it that we invented all those mythmes in the first place. If we explain our experience, what else is there? Baba says, and I left this slide out, I felt it was too much. In God Speaks, page 3 and 4, what are the planes? They are different states of experience. They are experience, okay? So everything is some kind of experience. Well, that's all Baba ever talks about, actually. Okay. The planes aren't places, they're states of consciousness. They're ways of experiencing. Okay. So even the higher realms falls under this point, okay? Now let's say we want to explain everything. By everything we mean everything. By thing we mean not just physical things, but internal mental things like thoughts as well. Okay, so we're going to explain all things, everything. We can group these into what we can call the class of all things. Okay? We're going to draw this circle like on the board. You can hardly see it on there. This represents a class. A class is a category, a grouping together for discussion. This is the class of all things. That's what this represents. Now, in this class of all things, we have puppy dogs, and we have hats, and cats, and dogs, and we have dreams, and we have pains, and we have, okay, we've got everything. So we've got mental things, and we've got physical things, all things. And even theoretical things in our mind, they're going to go in here. Our mythmes are things, okay? Those hypostatized objects that we invented to explain our experience that didn't work. They're in here, okay? Because they're mental things. Now, it doesn't make much sense to posit a thing to explain the class of all things. Okay, so if I got a thing out here, and it's going to explain that class of all things. Well, that doesn't make any sense because this would then belong to the things we are trying to explain. Okay? That kind of nukes the whole thing I was trying to say last week. Is that anything that tries to explain everything would fall into the class of all things and therefore be something that demands explaining. Okay. So, we're going to explain everything with nothing. Okay. Obviously, we have to explain all things without coming up with a thing to do it, which I just said. If we did, it falls into the class of all things. That's what we are going to begin to do now. Not going to use a thing, as they have since time began, since people began to try to explain things. They invented things to explain the things. So what can we posit if not a thing? A posit is something we offer as a solution. A posit is a hypothesis. Okay. We just finished saying we can't offer a thing. That wouldn't make sense. So what? Now, Ockham, or Ockham, was a Franciscan friar who came up with what we now call Occam's razor. And that's the idea that the simplest theory is the best theory, and it's the foundation of science, okay? And the Franciscans were very influential in producing the means of science. There's other ones too. Copernicus was a Franciscan. what he means, what Ockham means, is the theory that relies on the least hypotheses, meaning here unproven assumptions, the least of those, is the most likely. For frankly, there is less to be wrong. And so we give the example here of a die with 12 sides. So you call a number on one of these, you don't have as good a chance of getting your number than if you throw a die with 6 sides. So it's actually probabilistically provable that Ockham was correct. Extrapolating from Ockham, I say Ockham, because I don't know what's the right way. If extrapolating from Ockham's razor, the idea, if we can explain everything with no unproven assumptions at all, we would have the ideal explanation. That follows. Wouldn't it be great if we could come up with a process that explained everything, that's that little hand, that didn't rely on any speculations at all, where nothing had to be taken on faith? What do we know with absolute certainty? That we perceive things, thoughts, feelings, and objects. We perceive things. We know this. That perception is happening. That's what Descartes realized before he rationalized again. He realized he could doubt all the actual existence of the external object things, but he couldn't doubt that he was doubting, and he really couldn't doubt that he was perceiving them. Okay? But then he reinvented the whole external world again through rationalization and the thinking, rationalizing from the Bible and stuff like that. And as I said, he was never convinced, and he actually brought the attention of the world to the mind-body problem. But the point here is that that's what it means. I perceive, therefore I am. You know, perception is happening. Forget the I am. Just perception is happening, because there might not be a you perceiving. There's a book. It's a Buddhist book, and it's called Thoughts Without a Thinker, and the title says the whole idea. So Descartes was really kind of wrong. The only thing that he had established is that perception is going on, experience is happening. That's the real thing that Descartes discovered. The rest was all just his assumption. Okay, so to say perception, taking experience, is not happening contradicts itself. You can't say that. It makes utterly no sense, and it's a downright lie. Okay? Remember the behaviorists, and remember what's called the eliminative reductionists, and these materialists that are very extreme, and they deny consciousness, and they say we're not conscious, we're just robots, and we're acting like we're conscious. That's absolutely asininely self-contradictory, because they're pointing to the external behavior of ATM machines and people that they're claiming are just like functioning ATM machines, robots. So they're actually contradicting themselves even in their own claims. You can't deny your experience. The very denial of experience is a statement of experience. That we are perceiving our thoughts and things around us cannot be coherently denied then. So why posit anything else? Why not just say perception is happening and be done with it? Perception alone, without a mytheme, is an idea that has been tried throughout history by different people, okay? And it was first tried, we'll get to that in the next slide. We're going to see why it failed, and why philosophers and scientists have always resorted to positing a second unseen substance or stuff or world that's causing our experiential one. There's a reason that they do. There's something in the nature of our experience we're going to look at that Baba even refers to, and that those ideas don't account for it. There was, in one of the dialogues by Plato, it's called the Taititis. It's a very deep dialogue. It talks about knowledge. And Socrates is the protagonist, whose Socrates is already dead when Plato wrote the Taititis. But in the story, he asks a boy that's brought to him, what is knowledge? And the first answer that the boy gave is perception. Okay? I perceive it, so then I know it. And then Socrates, he says, you have the idea of Parmenides, Protagoras. I wrote Parmenides, that's a mistake, sorry. It should be Protagoras. He said, you're talking about Protagoras. Yes, he was a pre-Socratic, and he said that. And then he said, so Protagoras would say, he's the one who said, a man is the measure of all things. Now what he really meant was each man is the measure of all things. So if you see it as big, then it's big for you. Okay, that's what he meant. And if somebody else sees it as small, then it's small. Okay, so each person sort of has their own reality. It's relativism, okay? There's sort of no objectiveness to it. It's just what you see is your reality, and that's reality. And that's all reality is. We have a lot of realities then, And you still hear this a lot these days in New Age stuff. So, but he said, but that might be true for Protagoras. I forget exactly how he worded this, but I forget the idea. Anyway, he objected to it. He said it doesn't work. There are objective experiences. There are things that we all share in our experience. Now, Baba mentions the objective and the subjective aspect of experience in the discourses. And I quote it here. I copied it, pasted it right there. There are two aspects of human experience, the subjective and objective. On the one hand, there are mental processes which constitute essential ingredients of human experience, like judgments, I would say. And on the other hand, there are things and objects to which they refer, to which such judgments refer. Okay? And the judgments are due to sanskaras, but then what we're referring to, what they're making judgments about, that's the given. That's the given experience, the given world. Okay, so why just perception never worked? All such attempts ended in solipsism or relativism. Plato pointed this out with Protagoras. I guess I had a couple slides in there more than I needed. There's a very good reason it didn't work. Such attempts don't account for the objective and the subjective. They're all the subjective, your subjective perception. It only accounts for half of our experience. For part of what we perceive is private, but part of it is shared. One kind of thing that's the same, that's different for each person, that's subjective, is like smells and tastes, depending on conditions, okay? And of course your dreams are private, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the other hand, you have what are called primary qualities. They're mathematical qualities. And everybody who goes to measure them finds them to be true. So for instance, there are 3 objects on that table. We'll all agree there are 3 objects on that table. That there's too many objects on the table, well, we might disagree about that. Or not enough, okay? So you get the idea. Some qualities are the same. The ratio of the height to the width of that head would be the same for anybody who goes over there and takes out a ruler and checks it. No matter what kind of ruler they have. They can have a ruler from another planet and they would still get the same ratio. The numbers would reduce to the same number. So these numbers are the same for everybody, okay? That's something that's always the same. This is what philosophers noticed. Galileo noticed this. And even he's really the first to come up with this idea that there are 2 kinds of qualities. Some are the same for everybody and some are relative. They're different for each person. Okay. Okay, it's called the primary quality distinction. Now I'm going to show it here. So, an example, although that was not bad just talking about the number of things on the table. Well, one person sees this shape when they look at the sun, and another person sees this shape, and we would all agree it's not the same shape. Now, they could change places and it would change. So obviously, what they're perceiving is not the real fundamental state of the thing. This is what Galileo was thinking about that made him come up with this external world, okay? So, those are private qualities. But the qualities where we go and we reduce the geometry of this object, we have all kinds of mathematical stuff going on. That's the same for everybody that looks, okay? So therefore, that's where you get this gradually this idea that these things are out there in the outside of us, and these things are inside of us. Get at the internal world, external world. That's where this comes from. And then eventually, this became, it never really worked, the idea of these two worlds, because I showed that Locke tried to make it coherent. And he did the substratum. I did that a few talks ago. I won't redo it. Okay? And the substratum didn't make any sense, and he admitted it didn't make any sense. He said we don't have any more evidence of the substratum that's holding up the numbers than we have for spirit or something else. It's completely mysterious. I have no idea what I'm talking about. Then Berkeley realized he doesn't know what he's talking about, so everything's perception, and then round and round like this. Nobody's been able to solve this. Okay, I think that covers that. So this is why the external world seemed like a good idea at the time. We need to see what it's good for there is, in fact, a good reason. Clearly something independent of our minds, which they called external, but they really just meant independent of our subjective experience, seemed the only possible answer. Remember Locke's words when I just sort of summarized them. We can't imagine exist without something to support them. So we came up with the substratum. That's an example of a mytheme or a nominal cause. It's a cause in name only. Now we have a name, but it's just a placeholder for someday having an explanation of how it actually explains our experience on the two kinds of qualities. You got that? That's what we tried to explain last week. They weren't dumb. They simply could find no way to account for the shared qualities that were clearly independent of our individual minds. A lot of New Age discussion, like the movie What the Bleep Do We Know, is not aware of this problem. It's very naive, and it's not real philosophy. It devolves into solipsism and relativism, which is where the movie ends. Well, I have my own world. So, having seen the failure of the method of positing things, mythemes, to explain the class of all things, I hope you will recognize that we need to find another way. Okay, there are some benchmarks that a new way of looking at the world has to hit. If we only get through these, it'll be good. But there's more. I have more to say. We're going to go over 14 benchmarks that a new way of thinking has to achieve for it to be plausible. Anything else and it'd be like, oh, that's a great idea. Okay. The idea, a new idea, has to provide a process by which the things in our experience arise in our experience. Not simply a name of something with no further elucidation. In other words, it will solve the mind-body causal problem. How does experience arise in us? By some process, not just give us a name for it. That's not doing anything at all. We don't want a hypostasis. That means a thing that's where you're treating something like that's not a thing, like it's a thing. Like I said, like Santa Claus. No theoretical occult thing to explain our experience. No mything. If we just have a theoretical occult thing, it belongs to the category of all things. Right? It has to account for public and private qualities, as we just talked about. It accounts for both the objective and subjective, which even Baba referred to in the discourse. Not a solipsism, or it must not be a solipsism or a relativism. It must be objectivist. Okay? We have to have an objective world. In a monism, We want both. We want an objective world, and we have our internal experience, our pains and sufferings and worries and thoughts and dreams and judgments. It has to be a monism. It can't be a two-world dualism, like you mentioned, Bill, that you're tired of all this Western dualism. And therefore, it will not have a mind-body skeptical problem. If we don't have two worlds, it's not going to be a doubting about some other world we can't see. Baba never talked about any external world in that sense. Never did that. In fact, he said, page 3, God speaks, a gross conscious person experiences through his body the gross world. He doesn't experience a representation of it. He didn't say that. He said he experiences the gross world. Okay? Now, it must conform to our intuition that matter is what we perceive. That we experience the world directly. This whole thing that I'm not seeing the real world is not how people intuitively feel that it is. That's not intuitive. The word matter here will be used in its normal sense as denoting the qualities we see, hear, smell, etc., all around us, not representations of something else. It must be simple, following Occam's razor, meaning, but it must not be simplistic, which is a difference. Simplistic is like the magical turtle that invented the world. See, I explained the world. Simplest explanation in the world, but it's simplistic. What we mean by simple is it needs to be that monism. There needs to be some substance and some process, some principle by which we can explain things. One, but it doesn't just mean one turtle with a magical turtle. Okay, it explains everything we can possibly experience, physical, subtle, mental. Otherwise, we're far outside the explaining the sum of all things. If we understand, we believe Baba. It accounts for and explains our intuitions in the mathematical traditional sense of 1 plus 1 is 2, which as I said, is an intuition because you don't actually observe that 1 plus 1 is 2. For instance, how do you know it's going to be 1 plus 1 is going to be 2 tomorrow? You can't see tomorrow, so obviously it's something that you just know. It's very simple, but that's what intuition is, something you know, but you don't know how you know. I'm going to talk about them more in a couple weeks, pretty deeply. It needs to be natural, a natural explanation. They're always making a big deal about, we don't, all these airy-fairy stuff. We want a natural explanation. This is, and all they mean is the natural laws. Okay, it conforms to the natural laws. There's no other word. What do they mean? Like holistic? No, they mean to conform to the natural laws. Thus harmonious with science. Okay, we want to be able to have a scientist come tell you something really true that's proven, and then we go, well, that can be accounted for. Okay. It needs to explain our innate and inborn expectation of patterns, correlations, and causes that make language possible, that make thought possible, that make a baby be able to begin to learn. The baby is born looking for certain things. How is that? It's not even enough to just say reincarnation, because as Plato realized, well, then how did you learn it in your last life? Okay, there's the next. Okay. And it conforms to our innate sense of something that transcends the world of appearances. God, or an oversoul, or something. In different cultures, you have many names. The absolute, something that's transcendental. Positive moral consequences, unlike behaviorism, nihilism, atheism, materialism, relativism, all those things, they have not given us good fruit. It must give us good fruit. It must make us good people, because that's a virtue to an idea. In accord with the revelations of the saints, and by the saints, I mean Baba and the saints. Okay, so I didn't make two categories. It conforms to what Baba tells us, and other saints, and Indian saints, Western science. And I'll show those kinds of quotes later, in a later talk. It accounts for our use, finally, number 14, it must account for our use of the body to perceive. And therefore, it will solve the mind-body interaction problem. We don't want to say it's so abstract that it's just like, why do you even have a body? Berkeley's idea was like that. He really didn't, I mean, it's like, well, why do we have bodies if it's just ideas implanted in minds and it's all immaterial? It doesn't make any sense. Okay, now the perceptual schema, this is the last thing we're going to talk about. I want to introduce this idea. We've already, and how are we doing?
Good.
Okay. All right. Okay. This is a big deal, but it's kind of fun. It's not stressful, kind of out of that heady stuff, okay? We're going to start, because perception is fun. My dad was an artist, and my dad used to teach me things when I was a little boy about perception. He'd take me to the beach, and he'd go, you see, when you hold out your hand, the top of the ocean, the horizon is straight ahead. But if you get down on your knees, it's still straight ahead. And things like that, pointing out perception. He was very, very aware of perception. And I became aware of perception because I had an artist father going blind. It's not something you can really ignore. It's something that's always on your mind. I also had a background as a camera assistant, changing lenses, putting on filters, that kind of thing. And doing the projecting dailies. Then in my early life, that was helpful too. I'm very aware of perception. Perception's fun. Okay, this is just basic Gestalt, but I want us to be aware of it. So, I guess you all know this one maybe, but in case there's some people that don't know, this can be seen two different ways. Okay, one way is that this is the facing you, okay, and then this is the front, and sort of pointing down like that. The other way is that this is the front, and it's pointing like that. Now, you can't see both those at the same time. You switch. No matter how you can spend hours on it, you'll never catch it switch. Because it's like, it's not in time. It's called a Gestalt switch. Okay. Now, just to anybody doubt it, there's the original figure, and then there's two ways of looking at the same thing. So perception is not as simple as just perceiving stuff. We perceive, there's ways of perceiving. There's schemas. A schema is organization. We organize our experience. Okay, so a perceptual schema is a way of organizing our experience. This is called the duck rabbit. It's very famous. First appeared in a book by Wittgenstein, and he found it in a German magazine. They found the magazine. If he looks this way, it's a duck looking up. And if it's looking this way, it's a rabbit. They can't see the rabbit and the duck at the same time. It's fun to experience. This one, I had a hard time when I found this in all these books. By the way, this is not from Gestalt psychology. It's from a philosopher who, the focusing on this was, his name is Norwood Hansen, and he was an American. And he died, his book came out the year I was born, and I just worshiped this book. When I discovered Hansen, it was like, somebody like me. Somebody wants to talk about something fun. He talks about causes a lot. I learned a lot about cause from him. Anyway, this is a woman. There's her chin, there's her nose, and it's a beautiful young woman. And then she has a big French hat. And then the other way is it's an old woman, and there's her nose, and there's her mouth, there's her chin. Okay, this one you can see it as two men looking at each other, or you can see it as a vase. This is actually a drawing by Norwood Hansen from his book called Patterns of Discovery. Wonderful book. Maybe one of my favorite, probably my favorite book of philosophy. It's not a short, long book. Published the year I was born. There's a bear climbing on the back of a tree. Now, These markings, we all see a wolf. But that's a basic Gestalt point, is that there's not enough there to be a wolf. You're not getting enough information. You're organizing that. So you're seeing that through a perceptual schema. Okay? You're schematizing it, organizing it into a wolf. We all know that's a rabbit. If you haven't seen a rabbit, would you really recognize it as such? That's important. Okay, that's going to be important. This is Jesus. Does everybody see Jesus? Some people never can. It's one of the harder ones. I have a cheat coming next. This was originally taken by a man in China, Chinese man, of the snow with his camera. I don't know what decade, long time ago. And he got home, he developed the picture, and he saw Jesus. There's the original picture of the snow. There's the takes out some of the information, and a Christian website created that image to look like Jesus. I hope you can see it now. We seek a way to explain the appearance of all things, mental and physical, without positing a thing. How do we explain without a thing, without mythemes? That is what we'll show now. I guess I messed that sentence up. What we'll show next week. We will have explained everything while positing nothing, leaving us nothing further to explain, and we'll hit the 14 marks. Now the remaining talks, oh my God, I don't know if, it's the last slide, so it's okay, it broke that thing. All right, the remaining talks are as follows. This was talk 8. Talk 9, which will be next week, next Saturday, will be the new way of thinking that is the reason for having given these talks in the first place. Okay? It's an idea that I've worked with a lot of people help me, a lot of academics help me. I'll talk about that next week. And that's and then talk 10. After that, the following Saturday, we'll at last bring in intuition in a very special sense, sufficient to make Baba's words make perfect sense about a transition to intuition we are now going to go through, in my opinion. Of course, that's my opinion. But I think that some people will be convinced that I'm right, or could be right. And we won't know because we don't have Baba here to go, thumbs up or thumbs down. We're just guessing now what Baba meant by things. Baba's words, and talk 11, Baba's words in support of all that has been said. That's the 11, and then conclusion is 12, because there will be other things I want to say, and will be done. That's it. Thank you very much. Jai Baba.